So as most of you know, I have decided to preach a 4-week sermon series on the lessons of creation, inspired by Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is really just like reading poetry. It's such a beautiful testament to our earth and to creation. Elizabeth Gilbert's quote on the front says it's a hymn of love to the world, which it truly is. I wasn't sure how I'd feel about reading about grass and things for a whole book. But you can see all my little marks, and that's not even all the ones that I have in here. So let me share this part. This comes from a chapter called Mother's Work. Being a good mother doesn't end with creating a home where just my children can flourish. A good mother grows into a richly eutropic old woman, knowing that her work doesn't end until she creates a home where all of life's beings can flourish. There are grandchildren to nurture, and frog children, nestlings, goslings, seedlings, and spores, and I still want to be a good mother.
Children are the heritage God gives us. Our descendants are our rewards. Take care and be diligent in guarding yourselves, that you do not forget those things which your own eyes have seen. Do not forget them as long as you live, and teach them to your children and your children's children.
Would you pray with me? Spirit of God, as we breathe in, help us to breathe in the calmness and peace, the harmony of your Spirit, remembering that we are all connected by breath to the trees, to the flowers, to the animals. We are all one on this earth. May the words of my mouth, meditations of each of our hearts, be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So let me begin with a footnote. I'm going to push you back, Bev, because I want to come forward. As we're talking about Mother's Day, I'd like for us to expand the concept of mother for the time that we're talking, at least. And that being a mother doesn't just mean that you gave birth to a child. It doesn't mean that you've raised a child. It doesn't even mean that you act like a child. Boy, I said that funny, didn't I? Probably a lot of us act like children. Anyways, that was not what I meant. It doesn't mean that you act like that you're acting in the role of a mother. But that mother is an archetype. Y'all understand what an archetype is? So an archetype is it's like an energy, it's a pattern, it's a model that exists within each of us. So we have the mother archetype and the father archetype and the protagonist and the antagonist and the jester, and all of these archetypes are pieces of each of us, and we can draw from the different energies within us. And so today I want to talk about the mother archetype, the things we think about when we think about mother, and that energy that isn't simply a female energy, but that flows through all of us. So what comes to mind when you think about characteristics of a good mother? Positive characteristics of motherhood. Loving, nurturing, patient, consistent,
encouraging,
supportive, encouraging,
Reliable.
sympathetic,
smart,
what was that?
smart,
Smart, intelligent, sure,
forgiving,
forgiving, You've got them all, don't you, Cedar? Strong.
Confident.
A confidant, someone you can trust. Someone who's a teacher. Someone who's compassionate, kind, generous, giving. There's a whole lot of pieces to that mother archetype. And when we channel those pieces, we channel that mother energy. We all have female energy, we all have male energy that runs through us. When we channel those pieces, we're channeling our mother archetype. So for the next 20 minutes, if you can expand your understanding of motherhood to something that is not necessarily male or female, but it's the way we are in the world. Does that make sense? I hope. Yes. Nod your head or shake your something. Or lie to me. I don't know. Okay. So last week we started by talking about the power of words. That the words that we speak show our regard for other people or other things in the world. And we talked, so they show respect or not, they show care or not, they show whether we like them or not, whether we want to include them or exclude them. We talked about how the power of words can help us to see things a certain way. And so we talked about seeing more things as beings. That we talked about seeing nature, the trees and the animals and the flowers and the frogs and the grass and the water as beings instead of objects to do with what we want. So I would suggest that the power of words is also in our stories. In the stories that our religion tells, in the stories that our families tell, in the stories that our culture tells. And so I shared with the kids the Skywoman story to get another understanding of what someone else's creation story looks like. And so you have this woman who falls to the earth and is captured by the animal, held by the animals, kept safe by the animals until she can create earth of the mud, the mud from underneath the sea. That's all that exists is water everywhere. Until she dances her gratitude and expands the earth, the land, until there's earth everywhere. And then she plants trees and flowers and bushes and all the living, growing things, and she nurtures it until the brown earth turns green. And she has a place for animals and people to live. Robin Wall Kimmerer calls her our ancestral gardener, our co-creator of the good green earth who created a beautiful place for her descendants. There's power in that story, power to teach. The power of stories can help us with understanding and with teaching and learning and growing, or they can also send us into waves of guilt or anger or hurt or frustration. They can send us down a good road or a not so good road. And so we have that story of creation. I want to consider then the story that probably most of us grew up with as the story of creation. We heard the Genesis 1 version last week, which was, God created everything and it was good, which is awesome. If we go into Genesis 2, we have the story of Mother Eve. So we have Skywoman, who is the mother of all things for natives, and we have Mother Eve, who for many of us was we were taught was the first woman, who unfortunately got taken in by a talking snake, ate the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, said, "Hey, Adam, tastes good, have some." And because of that, they both get kicked out of utopia, out of heaven, out of the garden. As punishment, they're forced to live off a land that's difficult. Before they could pick an apple off the tree and just eat it and they were good, and now the story says that they would have to toil for what they were going to have to eat. that they would, have sweat on their brow just to have bread in their stomachs. And that she would suffer in childbirth. And when they died, they would return to dust. You know that whole from dust you came and to dust you shall return? All part of that Genesis 2 story. So we have these two creation stories. If we look at them, what's the difference between them? What's the difference in how they make you feel? And if you're going to share one with your children and your children's children as a legacy to carry forward throughout the centuries, which one would you take? Which is the second one? The Skywoman story? Why? It's more of a warm story and a warm ending. Anybody else? Eve or Skywoman? Kind of sounds like we're doing Marvel comics or something, doesn't it? Nobody else wants to choose. I'd take Skywoman. If I want to teach my children, I want to teach them to plant. I want to teach them to be in harmony with the animals. I don't want to teach them about a God who said they were bad and kicked them out of the garden. And I have to wonder if those stories have affected the way that we've treated Mother Earth over the years. Because in addition to the whole Eve got kicked out of the garden, we have Genesis 1 that said you should have dominion over the earth and subdue it, right? Dominion over the earth and subdue it. The Hebrew words were even a little more not kind. In the last maybe 100 years, we've tried to change that word into have stewardship over the earth, which is really nice. But we had all of those centuries where we weren't having stewardship. We were having dominion and subduing. And what's happened to Mother Earth because of it? She's been getting destroyed. Let me give you one example of perhaps the difference in stories and the power of these two mother stories. So have you ever heard of the great Cedars of Lebanon? That ring a bell? So they're mentioned like 70 times in the Old Testament. The great Cedars of Lebanon were these huge, huge trees. Like thousands of years old, 160 feet tall, and just strong and hardy, these beautiful trees. There were about 1,500 kilometers of these trees in the Mediterranean area, the Middle Eastern area, until like the ancient historic time of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and Solomon and all of those folks who used the cedars to build palaces and homes and sanctuaries, the temple and navies, the boats they built with them. The temple of Solomon is said to have been lined with cedar. The walls were cedar and the ceiling was cedar and the rafters were all made of the cedar trees. And they used them and they exploited them until they're all but gone. Of the 1,500 kilometers of these great forests, there's like 17 kilometers left. There's maybe, I think these are 20 old growth forests where some of those trees are 2,000 years old now. But we lost them because of greed. So compare that with the Native Americans who lived in the Pacific Northwest for millennia. And they lived there in the forests and on the ocean in that area. And they lived with respect and with gratitude and in harmony with all of nature. In a sustainable way, they lived. And they had cedar trees too. Huge cedars, 200 feet tall, about 50 feet around, rivaling the redwoods. But in their tradition, those trees were beings, like we talked about last week. Specifically, the cedar was known as Mother Cedar. She provided everything that the people, almost everything that the people needed from the time they were born until they died. And the people lived in a reciprocal, sustainable relationship with them where they respected these beautiful trees who cared for them. So the women didn't, take more than they needed. They didn't take Mother Cedar wastefully. If they needed something, they would go singing into the forests, and they would look for the right tree. And when they found her, they would ask permission to take some of her for what they needed, and they would say prayers, and they would offer gratitude, and maybe they would leave a gift. And cedar is tough and it's hardy, and they would cut a wedge about a hand's width wide into the tree, and then they would pull a long strip from the side of that tree, about 25 feet long. But it was small enough that the tree could heal, and it didn't affect the health of the tree. But from that one strip, they would pound it, and then they would shape it with a deer horn, and they would create cedar wool. And that cedar wool would line a baby's crib. And they could take that cedar wool and they could weave it into clothes and into blankets. And so Mother Cedar held them from their first breath. The cedars provided almost everything that they needed. They sat on cedar mats, and they slept in cedar beds, and they ate from cedar bowls, and their fishermen had cedar canoes, and their oars were made of cedar, and their harpoons and their arrows and their fishing nets and their rope was all made of cedar. The branches provided tools and traps and baskets. And when it was cold, they took the cedar that had fallen, because we know it doesn't decay quickly, right? They would take the cedar that had fallen and they'd burn it for firewood. And she kept them warm in the cold winters. And then if they got sick, there was medicine in Mother Cedar's leaves, if you will, and in her branches and in her roots. They could use her roots too, and they could strip them apart, and they used them for thread in their hats and in their ceremonial headdresses. They used every single part of that tree. And when they died, they made cedar coffins, so that Mother Cedar embraced them from beginning until end. And it's said that Mother Cedar had spiritual strength to offer. That there was a great energy that flowed through her, and that if you were worthy, that energy would flow right into you if you would just lean back into Mother Cedar's embrace. And then white men came with their industrial foresting. And within 500 years, there were no longer any old-growth cedar forests or their ecosystems in the area. And I wonder how much the stories had to do with that. The stories that we've told, and what our relationship is to each other and to the earth. How does that form us? How does that shape us? How does that change how we act in the world? I gotta say, not proudly, that until all that recently, I couldn't have told you what a cedar tree looked like. It looked like a board that I got at the hardware store, right? To make my garden beds because it didn't decay quickly. And it made the fences that go around our yard. And that's all I thought about cedar. I didn't think about Mother Cedar and where she came from and what it cost her and what it cost the earth. You know, most of you probably know that I lost my mom when I was 17. And I was young, and I was self-centered. And so I didn't think about what I was losing at the time, you know? And I didn't have anybody to help me understand what I was losing. I didn't have, you know, neighbors or grandparents or even my parents who kind of said, you need to wake up and pay attention to this relationship because it's not going to be here long and you're going to miss it when it's gone. I had nobody who said, you know, boy, you're going to miss it your whole life when you graduate and when you get married and when you have kids and when you start a church and all these crazy things that happen when you just want a recipe or when you want to know where you came from and who your family was. I didn't even think about any of that. I was 17, what did I know? Other than everything, right? I took her for granted, probably every day of my childhood. You know, mothers, all those things you said about mothers, that's who mothers are. They nurture us and they give and they care for us because that's what mothers do. And they don't fuss about it. They just give and give because that's what mothers do and they don't expect anything in return. And so it's easy to take our mothers for granted, including Mother Earth, who gives and gives and gives, and we don't know what we've lost until it's gone. And we've lost so much. We've lost those old growth forests and rainforests, and our coral reefs are dying, and our glaciers are disappearing, and species are disappearing, and I could go on and on. And we're still taken for granted. You know that 20% of mammals, 1 in 6 bird species, and 40% of amphibians are all threatened with extinction. Now I understand that some extinction is part of our planetary evolution, but the last couple centuries have seen an abnormal amount of extinctions. And most of that is because of what humans have done. We take for granted and we've forgotten. And maybe it's because of that darn story didn't teach us. You know, the Bible basically doesn't teach us. There's not much in there that says, care for the animals, take care of the earth, plant a tree if you take one down. It doesn't say things like that. But what it did say is what Marilyn read today, which was we've been given children and grandchildren as a gift. And all of the things that we've learned, we're called to remember them, to take our experiences and our wisdom and teach them. Teach our children and teach our children's children what we've learned so that the world gets better. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about Paula Allen's book, Grandmothers of the Light, and the changing role of women as we grow in age. And I think it's really the same for all people. But she says, you know how a spiral starts small and then it grows bigger and bigger. And she said, you know, As we're young, we follow the way of the daughter, which is the way of learning and growing and trying to figure out who we are and becoming self-reliant. And we do that under the safety and shelter of our parents' home, hopefully. And then as we continue to grow out, we leave the way of the daughter and eventually we come into the way of the mother, and all of that experience and all of that learning and all of the values we now share with our children, and we use in taking care of our children. And we grow them until they become self-reliant and they leave the nest and go off. But the way of the mother doesn't end there. It continues, we continue to spiral out. It becomes the way of the teacher, where we use our wisdom and our knowledge, and we share that with our children's children, and we become mentors, and we become teachers, and we care for our community as that spiral goes out, and we eventually care for the world, and care for our earth. Being a mother, and channeling that mother energy for all of us, means that we continue to walk that spiral. We continue to broaden our range of care. We care for creation, and we teach our children. Amen.